Hello, good afternoon, good morning, or very much the middle of the night, depending on where you are. And welcome to Parallel Discussion 3C, What is the Impact of Public Deference to Scientific Authority? We started the morning hearing a compelling session on making public engagement in basic science equitable and inclusive. This really ties into the topic of this session, which is looking at the intersection of deference to scientific authority, deliberative democracy, and public understanding of science and technology. We'll be exploring what is the role and nature of scientific authority in shaping an informal policy. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. Please ask your questions over in the Q&A so that we can see them backstage. I'll be moving them over into Answered Live even before they're answered, so you all can see what is being asked by others. We're going to start with a presentation by Emily Howell. Emily, you can come on. Emily Howell is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work focuses on how to communicate controversial and policy-relevant science and technology issues such as fracking, human genome editing, and artificial intelligence. In particular, she is interested in how to increase communication and engagement across stakeholders with diverse experiences and opinions on important issues in science and technology. Emily's going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to have two discussants who I will introduce when they come on. Emily, take it away.
Great, thank you, Erika. So as Erika mentioned, my name is Emily Howell. I work in science communication doing research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I also work with the Civic Science Fellows program, where we're exploring how can we strengthen connections between science and people of diverse backgrounds and values. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of my research in this concept of deference to scientific authority and focus on what that means, and then especially what it means for engagement and with basic science in particular. So for a little bit of context, as Erika mentioned, most of my work focuses on these science-related issues where we have, as you can see in this figure, high decision stakes. We have to make a decision, and there's high stakes involved with what decision we make or not. And then there's also high uncertainty. And this is uncertainty both within the science itself, but then also in what the implications of the different decisions could be. So as you can see in this figure, sometimes this is called, oh, realize I've never shared the screen. Let's do that. All right, it's one of those where the dress rehearsal goes too smoothly and then you forget to do it in the actual talk. So here's the figure I'm talking about. These are issues where there's high decision stakes, as you can see, high uncertainty. These are sometimes called post-normal science, or you may also hear the term wicked issues. And these are issues like how are we going to develop and use AI in healthcare settings, vaccinations, issues like gene editing, climate change, and its many different impacts, such as more frequent and extreme flooding and wildfires, which we're definitely experiencing the wildfire side of that, where I am in Montana right now. And then, as we've all experienced this past year and continue to experience, the COVID-19 pandemic, where the science itself was changing daily, what we knew about the virus and what to do, especially early on in the pandemic, and the stakes were incredibly high. And as you saw with COVID, but this is true of all these issues, we had to make decisions before we had all the information that we wanted. And we wouldn't know what the implications of those decisions would be often until after we made them. So because of all these factors, for a lot of these issues, there isn't really a right answer, and there's plenty of space for people to disagree about what the right answer is. And it's tempting to think that if we just had more science information, we wouldn't have this disagreement. But although we tend to think of these as science issues in many cases, that's a bit of a misnomer because they really go beyond what science can answer alone. They get into these questions of what should we do? So in that sense, there are these civic issues with these civic or normative questions, where all the people who have a stake in the issue, whether they're affected by it or they're responsible for taking action on it, have to decide together what should we do. And we often won't have many of the people at the table who are most affected. And trying to get people at the table is very difficult. And then once they're there, communicating with them. So that's what we'll get into a little bit today. So these kind of issues are where a lot of the rationale for science engagement today comes from, that we have to bring people together to understand the issue completely, decide what we're going to do about it. And even though I focused on applied science and technology in the earlier examples, in reality and in how people think about science, there aren't really clean lines between basic and applied research in all cases. So many of these rationale for engagement also apply to engagement with basic science. So if you think of this idea that democratic norms, people have the right to shape their own lives through their government, and because science receives public funding, it can inform policy, affects people's lives, that they also have a right to shape how we use science. So in basic science, like the easiest example of this is questions of what we should be exploring and funding with public money. And you could think, even if you support basic science research broadly, there still may be competing interests in what we decide to fund, whether that's research on outer space, building particle accelerators, studying human psychology. But then more practically, there's also these really tangible benefits for both science and people from engaging with science. And this can include having a more diverse pool and perspectives to sort of check the assumptions that people have, talk about what questions we're exploring in science, what parts of the world we explore, and then through that process also have different lines of research that emerge that can be more relevant to people, and people themselves change through the process. People who aren't scientists may be better able to understand and use the scientists. Both scientists and non-scientists learn more about each other and build relationships, and everyone can kind of see how science matters in their own lives and in broader society. So these are sort of the goals of engagement, and where deference fits in is because it can either facilitate or be a barrier to that engagement. So deference to scientific authority broadly is just how much someone defers, sort of grants space to scientists in a given decision-making setting. And it has sort of two related definitions that are helpful for thinking through. One is just focused on respect. So you respect someone's opinion or knowledge, and you think it's important for a particular setting or issue, so you want to hear and incorporate what they have to say. But then there's also this sort of more active form of deference where you're actually granting someone decision-making authority or power. And you can think of these as sort of a staircase of increasing deference, from just respecting someone's opinion, wanting to include it, to then granting them decision-making power, but sort of more bounded, which I'll get back to then this less bounded or unbounded decision-making power. So what's key here is that more deference is not always better. And what really matters for understanding it, both what shapes deference and how ideal it is for a given setting, is how bounded or unbounded it is. And that really depends on two factors. So you can think of the context in which deference or engagement in decision-making is occurring, and the extent to which someone is deferring to scientists. So if you think of decision-making or engagement that's just on purely technical questions, ranging from purely normative questions about what we should do, and then think about the role or extent that someone defers to scientists, either as a participant in that decision-making or an advisor for their technical expertise, all the way up to being the primary decision maker for an issue. And so you can kind of imagine an ideal type of deference could fall somewhere along these lines, where if you have too little of it, it means not valuing expertise on these technical questions, particularly that scientists actually have the expertise to answer or provide answers for. Then on the other side, to overvaluing scientists' authority as experts in questions that science doesn't actually answer, and scientists can participate in as citizens, but not with scientific expertise, because it doesn't answer the what should we do. It can just inform it. So both of these levels of deference really misunderstand, I think, what science can offer. And often in science communication and engagement, we tend to focus down on the folks who we think are devaluing scientific expertise. But I'm going to focus in for a little bit on this higher level of deference and what it means. So there isn't much research yet that really explores deference and what it means in the real world, beyond just sort of these theories of how the concept should work. But with some of the research we're seeing so far, we're seeing that this type of misunderstanding of science and how it plays out in deference, especially higher levels of deference, both in scientists and non-scientist views, can really shape perceptions of who has a legitimate place in conversations and decision-making about science and what engagement should be. So to illustrate some of that, here's an example from a study that colleagues and I had conducted of Americans' views of who should be involved in shaping how we use human gene editing. And we found that people who were more deferent tended to be less likely to think that the public should be involved. It was more the strong form or authoritarian form of deference, where they didn't think that scientists should consult the public in their research, and they didn't think that citizens should be involved in developing regulation on human gene editing. And in an ongoing study, we're seeing some similar patterns in a sample of scientists and their views of non-scientist roles in shaping research and applications of synthetic biology. So I think what's interesting and important to note is we also looked at people's other views of science. So do they see science as an authoritative way of understanding the world, one of the best forms or processes we have for collecting information? And do they trust scientists for science information? And even though both of these are positively related to deference, and all of them are positively related to believing that scientists are capable of responsibly developing their fields, high trust and high belief in this value of science actually positively related, for the most part, to believing that citizens should be involved. So this valuing scientists at the cost of excluding citizens is really just particular to this strong form of deference. And this was work mainly on applied science, but you can see how it would be counterproductive to engagement in general, whether it's non-scientists or scientists who are holding these kind of stronger, more authoritarian or views that misunderstand what science can offer. But I think what's interesting about deference and some of these findings is how it's helpful for thinking through engagement more broadly. So that's both for understanding the context we're engaging in and understanding the people involved, both if you're a scientist yourself, other participants, and their roles and views and expectations that are related to the engagement. So for the first, you can see how much context matters in what ways. So for any issue or question you're engaging with, sort of looking at what are the technical aspects we're engaging on, what are the normative goals and concerns that are tied to that, and then given that, what kind of experience or expertise matters for understanding this issue more completely. So it may be that there's these technical questions, scientific expertise, excuse me, that are relevant, but it's very likely that there's also these normative questions tied in. And that's where thinking about who's engaging, what views of science and scientists or the particular topic they hold and how they're bringing those into the setting. And these could be views that are reflected in their levels of deference, which may be ideal or not, depending on the setting, but also recognizing that even if they don't appear deferent, it may just be that particular context, particular topic, or they may be deferent to a different extent, where it doesn't mean that they don't respect scientists' knowledge, it doesn't mean that they don't believe science is authoritative, and it doesn't mean they don't trust scientists. So I think that's where you can start to see how people may be seeing just particular normative concerns tied to a particular view or topic, or to science more broadly, that are shaping their views. These may be views about their relationship to science. Excuse me. One sec, I'm going to grab a thing of water. All right. So these views may be tied to these normative, or their views of science are probably tied to these bigger normative concerns. It may be, if you think back to basic science, views about government spending in general, or what we prioritize through government spending, what potential risks are from research and who has control in shaping those. I think power and control are especially important for thinking about how people relate to science. And then it might be that they just don't see value to this particular line of research, even if they value science more broadly. So all of these kind of concerns and normative, what should we do, questions that are tied to science more broadly are worth understanding, both to understand whatever issue you're engaging on and to understand different people better. So that brings me to this sort of last big point, is this is really useful for understanding what are people's goals, both your own, reflecting on your personal reasons. So if you want people to like or support science, what does that support look like? Is it deference? Is it believing that science is the best way to understand the world? Is it trust? And then there's nuance in these goals. If it's trust in scientists for what? Which scientists, which field, for what purposes? And then also seeing that these concepts and these views of science and scientists can be separate and might not go together. So certain levels of deference, if they're misunderstanding the power of science, if people are engaging and learning about science, they might end up becoming less deferent in certain settings as they better understand what science can offer. So because of this, even if you have very basic science research, or you think you're sharing scientific and technical knowledge in the engagement, it's very likely that engaging will also involve these larger questions, priorities, thinking about what science means for people and how we use it, and not just in the applications, but in how we use it to understand different parts of the world, where we choose to focus and why. And these can include sharing the very personal goals that go with research, like satisfying curiosity, wonder, hope, and giving everyone the power to engage with those. So unearthing this, I think, is something that engagement in particular can do, so everyone comes away with a more complete picture. So returning to this big picture, the hope is that this kind of reflection and nuance on what we're engaging for, with whom, what kind of experiences and expertise matter in these different settings for getting a complete view of science and how it fits into broader society, in people's lives will mean we can get better at understanding both the limits and the potential of science, what it offers for understanding the world, for making decisions, and we'll be able to have conversations on these bigger values and goals that we all have connected to science and how we engage with it. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the panelists, and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Emily. That really started us off very well. Now we're going to hear from two respondents and get their thoughts on the topic. The first person we're going to hear from is Eric Kennedy. Eric is an assistant professor and coordinator of the Bachelor of Disaster and Emergency Management at York University. His research is dedicated to building more resilient, equitable, and inclusive communities in the face of disasters. And then the second respondent is Ubaka Ogbogu. He is an assistant professor, cross-appointed to the faculties of law and pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences. He teaches and researches in the areas of health law and science policy studies. So Eric, I'll have you go first.
Thanks so much. And I feel the need as a wildfire scholar here and someone who studies wildfire decision-making to apologize to Emily for the unfortunate growth of my area of study. It certainly is something that impacts a lot of us, and I think provides an interesting case in which to ask these tough questions about values and priorities, and the way that we structure decision-making on issues that are complex and involve lots of different stakeholder constituencies. Given how little time I have here, I want to just highlight three things that came to mind out of Emily's really fantastic presentation and the great paper that underpins this. And I encourage you to go and read that, and hopefully we can share a link to that as well. I think this research draws out really productively and insightfully the differences between different roles we have for scientists and science in society, right? The role of how to do science, and then the role of what to do with that science and how to implement it. And this, just as an aside, is a debate we've had for quite some time in terms of internal and external values in the philosophy of science and other kinds of related concepts. I think, though, that one challenge here is that the question, that second one, the how do we use science, how do we implement science, it in and of itself has multiple parts as well, right? There's a version of that question that asks, what should our goals and priorities be, right? What are the things that we want to do or achieve? There's another version of that question that asks, how do we want to get there? How do we want to make that happen? And it may be that some folks who express deference want scientists' help on one of those parts and not the other, right? It may be that we do indeed want to turn to scientists for the question of how we get somewhere once we as society have chosen where to go, right? It may well make sense to have access to the most effective health interventions to slow down a raging pandemic once we've decided whether or not slowing down the pandemic is a priority we ought to have. And so I think disentangling that question, that second piece of what do we want to do with it, might reveal places where we want to be deferential to some aspects of implementation and not to others. A second thing that came to mind was that, and this is a challenge that faces both those of us who research these topics and the people we're researching themselves. But terms like scientist and public are really fraught because we can tend to treat these as homogeneous groups, right? To see them as being very consistent and idealized, when in fact, I think there's a lot of diversity and heterogeneity in this, right? The idea of deferring to science itself is complex when science is often contested, right? One of my colleagues and mentors, Dr. Dan Sarowitz, would point out the excess of objectivity problem here, right? There's science that will support many different points of view. And so the notion of deferring to science is difficult there. Likewise, deferring to the public, by the way, is just as hard because we have all sorts of problems with who gets empowered and disempowered, who's given a voice and not in these processes. The final point I'll make here before opening it up to the conversation that I'm really looking forward to is a more fundamental question about the trade-off we're studying here. And I think we do this in all sorts of contexts where we ask, okay, in the fire context, should people invest in preparedness or response measures, right? Should we put less money into firefighting and more money into getting our communities ready for fire? But sometimes these dichotomies, these binaries, can misrepresent what's going on in the world, right? The choices we make about how much we invest into fire don't necessarily, or fire response, don't necessarily have to determine or preordain how much we do or don't invest into preparedness. And likewise here, I was left wondering to what extent this question of deference is a real question that aligns with the actual mechanisms and causes in the world. So from a public perspective, it's not clear to me that the choice the public is actually faced with is how much do we defer to scientists versus how much do we have a say, right? At the end of the day, we know that moneyed interests and lobbying groups and powerful stakeholders are actually going to be the answer here. And all of these side skirmishes about should we trust the experts or should we have a voice as the public, these are all deck chairs on the Titanic compared to questions of governance mechanisms of science and how particularly powerful interests get to determine what happens. And likewise, from the scientific perspective, the question of should I be respected as a scientist or should I listen instead to the voices of the public? Number one, it's not clear that that's not mutually exclusive, right? It may be that we can do both of these concurrently and that doing one, in fact, helps us to do the other. But it's also not clear that that's actually a choice that any of us get to make, right? If you talk to scientists, the broad concerns are not with having authentic, meaningful, robust public voices engaged or us as experts. It's the fact that neither of these voices have any power in decision-making process. And I think this can sometimes be exacerbated even more in basic science, where we don't necessarily have a clear sense of mechanisms of where and how those interventions can happen. And so these sideline skirmishes about should it be a holistic public or should it be the scientific experts, they can sometimes distract from the questions of how do money and power and other kinds of features influence these ecosystems. Let me leave it there, but I just want to say, Dr. Howell, that was an excellent presentation and a really interesting paper, and it's a real honor to be able to have a chance to engage in these conversations. Thank you for such provocative and interesting and robust material.
Well, thank you, Eric. And yeah, you've given us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to be looking forward to unpacking that in just a few minutes. And now I'd like to welcome Ubaka for his commentary.
Thanks, Erika. And thanks, Emily and Eric, for those excellent comments on the presentation. It's tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. I also have 3 points to add to the conversation. But first, I wanted to apologize for not sending a bio that's more up to date. I'm actually just a professor in the Faculty of Law now, an associate professor in the Faculty of Law. I'm no longer with the Faculty of Pharmacy, just in case somebody starts to look for me in the Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Alberta. So with that, I have 3 points to add to the very interesting discussion we're having. And I'll try and be as clear as possible. There's a lot, of course, to respond to with this, but I'm going to try and contain myself since I have so little time. So the first is sort of this idea of science as a thing that we can defer to. And I'm going to stay with what Emily described as scientific expertise or the notion of overvaluing scientific expertise. Because I think it's interesting that when we're talking about high-stakes science, sort of related to what happened during COVID, in a situation which is in flux, changing constantly, scientists themselves are trying to understand the situation. To talk of science in that kind of context, to me, is a bit of a stretch. Science doesn't really have answers. It's trying to find answers, and it's revising those answers as we go along. And I think one thing that I find in the deference literature is a tendency to treat science as if it's a mechanism that produces answers that you can add to the discussion. No, I don't think that that's the view of science we should adopt. Science, to me, is a method. And what we should be debating is whether we should be deferring to the method of answering questions. And I think if we keep it there, we start to achieve more clarity. Because depending on the question you're asking, you can ask, is this the best methodology for answering that question? If it's a moral question, maybe science is not the best methodology. Scientists might wade into the debate, but they have nothing to offer there. Maybe it's a matter that should be settled by the moralists or by people who are religious or whatever. But we tend to think of science as if it's something that produces answers. I've never thought of science that way. Science is never settled. It is even any scientific theory we have today is subject to refinement and revisions. So the idea that it offers answers, maybe it offers a snapshot in time of what we should be doing on a particular matter, but that is subject to revision. And in that sense, the question we should be asking is, should we be deferring to the method of answering questions? The second thing I wanted to talk about, and I think Eric already talked about this, is sort of this idea of homogeneity in terms of how we view science and view the public. We tend to think that, scientists are representative of a particular form of expertise, but that form of expertise is actually quite diverse and diffuse in many ways. And so is the public. There's no one public. There's many publics with many points of view. And as Eric suggested, sometimes we don't even hear from the actual public because of how people gain power in public space, of people who can speak and not speak, communities that have a presence in debates and those that don't, people you ask the question and those you don't. So ultimately, what we find is that we can actually sort of talk about public or science without unpacking these terms a little bit further. Then I'll close by talking about sort of the idea of democratic legitimacy as it applies to publics. It really worries me when we don't think of publics as experts on moral issues. They are, in fact, experts on moral issues. Everybody has an opinion on morality, and they claim to be, the final arbiter of what that viewpoint should be. And so when they posit that, and if they have power, when they posit that, that can gain, sort of credibility and attention. Sometimes when we even ask for public opinion, we ask certain publics. You could ask, for example, a largely white population. You don't ask people who are racialized. At the end of the day, what you get are moral biases that we then treat as things that we should bring into the debate. So for all the things we talk about with deference, we also have to ask, why are we deferring to the public? And what public are we deferring to? And how can we really get around these questions of treating things that are very diffuse and diverse as homogeneous? And I think that, to me, is something that needs to, again, be looked at a little bit more closely. So I'll stop there. Thank you for allowing me to comment on a very wonderful paper by Emily, and thanks, Eric, as well for your comments, which I found very illuminating.
Well, thank you. If we could have Eric rejoin, we're now going to open up for Q&A. And just as a reminder, you can put your Q&A in over on the right side. I think I'm pointing the right direction, and we'll be taking those in. So one of the things I'd like to have, and we have a question kind of related to this, which is this concept that Eric introduced, that there are a lot more players in this field than just publics and scientists, that there's, different kinds of interests, corporate. And we have a question that came in about how can the scientific, governmental, private sector, the regional and the international organizations, so all of these different groups work together. And I think this is kind of an optimistic question. We can decide how we want to take it, but work together to guarantee the ethical and wise management of technology and science to benefit for all. So just how do all those players kind of work together, and what is known there? Who would like to tee us off here?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think this is...
Yeah, we'll let Emily start.
This is a little tangential maybe, but related. I think maybe it's Eric, you brought up this point of the power and the money that is behind the scenes. And I think part of my motivation in understanding deference is it seems like often these conversations we should be having about the questions like you raised, Erika, of how do we actually do this in practice? Where are these different views of science and an issue coming from? Is we keep getting stuck, at least in science communication. It seems like a lot of the broader conversations on people just need to know more about the science. And what I would hope is that we can actually get to what are these moral or sort of root concerns that are actually underpinning this. So with something like, going back to your point, Eric, if we look at vaccines, if we look at the opioid crisis, there's plenty of clear examples for why people shouldn't trust pharmaceutical companies in different settings. And we can't really look at views of vaccines without looking at views of pharmaceutical companies and also how that reflects the reality of the role that they play in society. So this isn't an answer to your question, Erika, but just sort of as an extra layer to that, those are the conversations that we need to have, of which science is just a piece of it. The technical vaccine safety, which, as you mentioned, Ubaka, is only the methods that we have available to us to have a best sense of that at this moment right now. But I'll leave it to Erika and Ubaka to chip in more on that one.
Ubaka, did you want to?
Oh, and I think you've gone muted on us there.
Sorry, I mute my microphone. No, you can go ahead, Eric. I'm still reflecting.
Sure. I mean, I think the one other layer that I'd add to this is that we have this, in some ways, a T-shaped problem, right? There's this question of how all of these different sectors work together in one place, in one cross-section, right? How do we get not just scientific expertise and public input, but also government processes and moneyed interests and industry and lobbyists and all of that sorted out. But there's also a transnational component to this as well, right? I think there are very tough questions to be asked of public engagement methods around how we manage and mitigate issues where you might have many nations working on emerging basic technologies, right? They're doing basic science on things that we might think are risky or dangerous or not in society's best interests. And governing that in one place doesn't solve the transnational governance challenge of governing that all across the world. And so I think there's also a global dimension to this too, which pushes even further, by the way, on what Ubaka was saying about the heterogeneity and diversity of communities and their values too, right? If we think engaging the public is challenging when it's my very homogeneous literal neighborhood, right? It becomes even more challenging when we're talking about engaging a global public on, should we be doing experimental virology work, or should we be doing geoengineering basic research, or should we, et cetera, et cetera.
So yeah, I'll add that the notion of working together intrigues me. I don't know that should be our default. The dissonance actually is part of the design. I don't know that we should necessarily be aiming for working together so much as in at least having the debate. We're never going to have agreement on many of these issues, especially when it's moral issues. And I think thinking of ways to work together might detract from the fact that there might be communities that actually want to engage from the point of view of, from a radical point of view. They don't want to work together. They want to destroy, and I think that's fine. I think we're set up, at least in liberal democracies, for that. And we have processes to deal with when we have intractable disagreements and how we can find resolution, even if we don't find closure. We can at least move ahead when it gets, to a very critical point, even if there's no closure. And I think on scientific questions and on scientific questions that engage moral questions, the idea of closure is not something that I think is possible. Even if somebody wins the debate eventually, and somebody gets their way, the debates are going to continue. For all of the moral issues we've talked about, embryonic stem cell research, vaccines, that's the way it works. So for me, I don't know if working together is something that I necessarily think we should spend too much time thinking about, so much as in we should think about how we manage processes for managing the disagreement in a way that allows us to be able to move ahead when we need to move ahead.
So I really appreciate that. And I do think that sounds like something from a law professor, because it's often in these kind of discussions that we're always trying to look for everybody to kind of join hands and sing along together. And I appreciate that you raising that sometimes having debate is a way of engaging, and that's, I really, really appreciate you recognizing that. It makes me think differently. I want to bring it back a little bit around to basic research, because you have been talking about sort of the intersection with politics and a lot of these kind of moral issues, but and it's not that basic science has moral issues in it as well. I would love if you could kind of comment, anyone of the panel, about how you sort of see all of these players and see the deference interacting in the basic science space.
I'll start us off.
Please.
I really think with basic science, we ought to allow as much room as possible for that. And the reason for that is that when it comes to the stuff that last stage of inquiry, at least historically, the presence of the kinds of moral disagreements that we tend to have over these issues don't quite arise. Of course, that's been challenged very recently with forays into things like stem cells and genetic manipulation. But I think there is something to be said for if you can establish a legitimate purpose for it. And how I define legitimate purpose is, of course, very complex as well, and it might differ from how Emily or Eric defines it. But I think if we can agree on that it has a legitimate purpose, and we can have a debate about that, there should be as much room allowed, not necessarily deference, but room allowed to discover things. But I don't know how that works out in terms of deference. I'll just give an example. If you think about the debate around CRISPR, for example, what we're debating is really about whether we should use CRISPR, the applications of CRISPR technology. But I don't think we're going to have much of a debate about the technology itself and how you use it how you sort of get to the point where you know that CRISPR is a thing. And so for me, I would like to see more of scientists being allowed to do work around basic science projects, unless, of course, they engage questions about the legitimacy of the project. That's what I can offer to that. More deference, I suppose.
Wonderful. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I can be provocative for half a second here, I think I would ask whether either deference or engagement can meaningfully exist in the context of purely basic science. And here I'm thinking as upstream as possible. Because I think it presents one of the most challenging cases for engagement scholars, right? In engagement, we often find that like localized, practical kinds of deliberations are easier to engage folks in than very abstract upstream what could possibly happen. And I think it's open for debate whether engagement at that level, when we're talking so abstractly about things that may or may not be and may or may not exist, whether that adds much value to the process. But conversely, I'm also not sure if deference can exist when you get to that extreme as well. Because Emily earlier talked about strong deference as allowing someone else to make decisions for you. And when we restrict this conversation to the most basic of research, as far away from the extreme of applied as we can get, there really is only one question that can be discussed in a substantive way, which is, should we or should we not open up this can of worms, right? But that question itself is a bit of a specter if we take seriously our discussion on the last question, which is that, I mean, I can decide for myself whether or not I'm going to open it, but there realistically is not a lot of way to come to a unanimous, homogeneous, uniform consensus in all times and all places about that. And so it's not clear to me that you can have deference in that space either, just because of the nature of this. So I don't know if that helps any, but hopefully that muddies the water in an interesting way.
Emily, your thoughts on that?
I think muddy is the right term, because as I'm listening, a lot of this resonates, but then as soon as an idea passes through, you're kind of like, okay, now what do I do with that? And I think we start to get into an area where it comes up a lot in deference, but in talking about science and people's views of science in general, is we may have very different views of this term. But I actually don't see that clean of a line between basic and applied research, largely because a lot of basic research is conducted in public institutions, funded by public institutions. And we also know, getting back to this idea of representativeness, that it's rare to be able to like conduct basic research. That's a very particular group of people, and that also reflects the other structural inequities that we have on who's able to contribute to those institutions. So these are kind of the ideas that are running through my head. I don't have an answer, and this was something I grappled with quite a bit, is what is deference in the context of basic science. But one thing that seemed clear is that deference, people actually are pretty deferent to the institutions that shape basic research, because we don't see a lot of, so sort of an alternative that you can think of to deference is activism. And we don't see a lot of activism coming outside of the scientific community trying to shape basic science. Sometimes there'll be pushback against what public universities are researching, the idea of kind of like, how useful is this? But I think in general, actually, people are pretty deferent to science in that sense, where they do grant this space. The deference is what allows that space for basic science to exist, in my understanding.
So maybe we can sort of, two quick buckets I can think of, because I'm thinking as everyone is speaking. There's basic science that engages moral questions. So should we use embryos for research, right? That's basic scientific research can engage moral questions. In Canada, we've used a law to ban that kind of research because it was highly controversial. But then there's basic research that I think does not properly situate itself within ethical norms that are accepted. One that is, that basically many basic research projects tend to violate, but nobody talks about it, are equity and justice norms, right? Why are you doing that? Why are you pursuing that when funding could be spent elsewhere on something else? If you think about the global context, why are we doing this? Why are we funding, say, research for gene therapy when we haven't solved some other problem in another part of the world? And I think that there's a legitimate case for public engagement and, for the kinds of questions we're discussing here about deference or not when it comes to those. But we don't have those debates. The kinds of moral issues the publics, at least in North America, gravitate to are the kind, I call them the sexy ones, are we talking about embryos or are we talking about, vaccines? Nobody talks about sort of this funding related type questions around equity and justice. I think that's one area where if basic researchers engage that, there's a legitimate question to be asked about whether or not we should be allowing scientists decide what projects to get into and whether they should be conducting those projects to find answers.
So we have so many good questions coming in, and we're rapidly running out of time. So we had a lot of questions that have come in that I think are kind of influenced by the dialogue that's in sort of the populist movements that we see in a lot of countries right now, whether in the United States or Brazil, where they're kind of a lot of people represent themselves as experts. It's also influenced by social media, where there are a lot of pseudo experts out there and a lot of sort of concern about the end of expertise. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection of deference and those kind of like larger socio-political movements? And we only have a couple of minutes, so if we can each maybe take just a few seconds to answer that.
I'll try to be really quick and just say that I think a lot of the time when people invoke both science and engagement, they're not actually invoking the thing itself, right? Ubaka turned us on to this distinction between other forms and science as a process, right? When you hear people bring up science in debates, it's often my science towards my points, right? They're leveraging a particular conclusion, a particular view, and trying to grant it the authority of science. And similarly, we can do that with engagement, right? It's my people, my voice coming through here. And so I think that's an aspect we have to reflect on as we leave this conversation is deference to science as the method the same as wanting people to defer to my science, and the same question for engagement.
Yeah, that resonates a lot, and I think that's something you see at least anecdotally, that people who might be branded as anti-science or not deferent actually are using science. Maybe it's particular cherry-picked studies in the case of the Wakefield study with vaccines and the connection between autism, or even the flat Earth movement, where they're out conducting, scientific experiments to try to figure out what the shape of the Earth is. So that would be the sense that there is this deference to science as a method. But I think that's where we start to get into these interesting questions of power and how much power people feel in being able to shape their worlds, which I think we're having sort of a crisis in more broadly, and science plays into that, and how people recognize that it has power to make their case for how they want the world to be. So I'll stop there so that Ubaka has time.
So I'll very quickly say everyone can frame themselves as an expert, and I think what matters is that we're having a debate where people are framing themselves, positioning themselves as something, and framing themselves as something. Ultimately, it turns into that soup I'm talking about, where we're all struggling for attention and authority. And when it gets down to it, the people who are scientists will present their view, and others will present their views, and one will win out in the end, I think.
Well, and we're going to have to end on that note with, I think, a real suspense that's sort of like coming soon, the answers of how this will work out, maybe. I want to really thank all of the panelists here for an amazing session. And I hope for you all out there that are listening in that you're going to stick around for the rest of the day. We're about to go into informal networking. So I know there were so many questions. This is a chance to get into groups and maybe talk amongst yourselves, compare and reflect. I hope that you will stay on later today for the brainstorming sessions and that you'll be able to participate in that, because it's really critical that this not just be sort of a one and done conference. This is really the start of a much larger project, and those brainstorming sessions are a chance for all of you to share your wisdom and insights. And so we really hope you'll participate. But thank you all so very much. You're absolutely wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye.